So welcome everyone to the second in this Bible Talk series in this autumn 2022 on the Word made flesh. And we welcome today the Archdeacon Macclesfield, whom Liz will introduce in a moment. But first, the words from John's Gospel. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Liz.
Thank you. So it's my privilege to introduce Ian, who has been Archdeacon of Macclesfield for almost as long as I've been Director of Studies for Readers, I think, 2011, which is 11 years, yeah. When Ian and I chat, it's usually about either Edinburgh or theatre, or quite often is, although we do talk church things sometimes. And Ian has a particular concern and passion for creation, and that's why you're going to speak to us today about recreation. So we look forward to what you've got to say, Ian. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Well, welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for the invitation. I've been given this title, How Do We Understand Care for the Environment, from John chapter 1. Well, it's an interesting title because I suppose the first thing to say is that when St. John penned the first chapter of his gospel, I'm quite certain that the environment crisis that we experience today was nowhere near his thinking. And so we have to be careful not to read too much, I guess, into that first chapter. But I think there are interesting things that we can talk about this morning. I'm going to focus particularly on the first 14 verses of chapter 1. You can't help but note that what John was writing was always, I think, intended to be something new. I think there is no apology from him for starting at what you might see as the cosmic level. In the beginning was the Word. We're pre-creation here, before all things. Before anything, there was something, the Word. There was before all things. Now, I would suggest to you that that's actually an audacious start, because what John is doing is going back even before the formation of the Old Testament, pre-Genesis, if you like. John clearly wants what he's about to say to take us back to the big story of God, the big story of the world. The language that he uses echoes Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You'll have read those words dozens and dozens of times, I'm sure. You can be sure that anyone who had even the smallest knowledge of Hebrew scriptures would immediately, reading that first chapter of John, have made the link between that and Genesis chapter 1. And yet John, as I say, is doing something quite audacious. I think he's reframing Genesis. He says, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Before Genesis, this word was integral to the creation process and integral to the meaning of all that was created, the created order itself. That word is interesting, isn't it? It's not unknown in the Old Testament, of course. Psalm 33, verse 6, by the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. Isaiah chapter 55, verses 10 and 11. God's word will go out of his mouth and bring life, healing, and hope to Israel and the whole creation. Nevertheless, the word, I think, is, or would have been, unfamiliar to those in the first century. I do have a question about exactly what the Hebrews would have understood by that term, the word. Maybe it was something to do with the idea of God actually speaking his very words, bringing life in some way? Well, we can understand that bit a little, I think, because when we say a sentence, we speak a word and that sentence exists. So imagine, I suppose, thinking that God was literally speaking created order into life. But I think that John knows that he is making language go beyond what's normally possible. He has to make language stretch. And he has to do that because Jesus doesn't really give him any choice. Because in verse 14, he says this, these epic words, you'll have heard them time and time again. The Word, that pre-existent Word, became flesh, that is, he became human, became one of us. He became human that we know as Jesus. The Word became flesh. It makes my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck go up. I don't know about you, but that idea of the pre-existent coming and dwelling with us. And in him, this Word, this Jesus, is light and life. Tom Wright rather beautifully says, the Word challenged the darkness before creation. That's rather a nice way of putting the idea of creation, isn't it? The Word challenged the darkness. And he goes on to take that darkness analogy a step further. And now the Word challenges the darkness that is found tragically within creation itself. The Word, he says, is bringing into being a new creation in which God says once more, let there be light. Now, I say all that because I think what John 1 brings us is context on life, where it starts, who started it, who holds it, who sustains it, and above all, in whom is life truly manifested. Now, assuming the technology doesn't let me down, I want to show you a short video. It's published by the London School of Economics, their faith department, and it's of Rowan Williams, and he's always worth listening to, talking about Christianity and the environment. Now, I'm sure you, like me, know that Rowan is always worth listening to, but he's not always the easiest person to listen to. So I want to pick out, before I play the video, just a few things you might want to listen out for. Firstly, note that he describes creation as communication from God. There we are, there's the idea, words spoken out. You'll hear him say that creation carries with it the divine gift. And that concept of creation as divine gift, I think, is key for the way that we look at life, and indeed the way you have to look at John chapter 1. The way you look at those things, and as gift, be thankful. And then he goes on to talk about the one divine word, and everything we experience in the world around us is a little echo of the word, the spark of the divine in everything that we see. And he frames environmental theology that way so that we can look at creation as something that we should give attention to, that we should praise and appreciate, and that drives us towards a real sense of humility in ourselves. I'll come back to that. In other words, to see ourselves as kind of insignificant. We are just players in this whole creation big story of God, unimportant in the great scheme of things, and yet created, called, and loved within the creation for a purpose. To see solidarity with the divine, to love the creation he gives, and to nurture it as something which holds the spark of the divine. It's to be deeply treasured. Let me take you to your idea, your experience of creation. Have you ever had one of those moments of awe when you've been looking at creation? I hope you have. One of those moments, perhaps, when a stunning landscape just takes your breath away, or a vivid sunset that suddenly bathes the world in shades of red just makes you gasp. Or perhaps a mountain range that you see powerfully dominating the horizon, which makes you feel utterly small. Or a star-filled sky that seems to vanish into eternity, and you suddenly sense something of the immensity of all creation. Have you ever had one of those moments? I hope you have. Yeah, I think most of us probably have been through those times. Well, they are, it seems to me, absolutely to do with how we should see and understand ourselves in all of creation. We are just a very small part of the created order. And some people may think themselves very important. And I guess in the great scheme of things, some will be remembered at the end of all things more than others. But in truth, we are all small. But we are created and loved by God. Through him, all things were made that has been made, John says. Just think about that in terms of yourself. Through him, all things were made that has been made. There is something awesome about you. There is something deeply loved about you. And yet you are still just a very small part of all things. You are, as I need to keep reminding myself, although in my case it doesn't take too much reminding, I'm pretty small and unimportant. In him, though, was life. There is something very precious that if we know Jesus, we have something of the spark of the divine, the life that is given to all things. All that was breathed into existence all those years and centuries before still breathes to some extent in us. I was reminded as I was preparing this of Mother Julian's hazelnut moment, which you may well know all about. Mother Julian, who of Norwich, who had some extraordinary revelations. It's a wonderful moment in which we see her holding this tiny little thing, this hazelnut, at which she marvels. And turning to Jesus, she asks, well, what can this be? And he straight away tells her, it is all that is made. You've got to kind of think that one through for a moment. It is all that is made. The symbolism of the thing is not lost on her because she realized at once that this is expressive of all created existence, which moves her once more to marvel, asking how a thing so tiny could keep from falling into nothingness. And what answer does Jesus give her? He tells her that the entire universe of things is held in being, prevented from that final fall into nothingness because God loves everything he made. Indeed, things are precisely because he loves them. They receive their being only in virtue of this love. And so in her conversation with Christ, Mother Julian comes to see in that tiny little hazelnut the crystallization of three truths on which everything depends. Three truths. The first is that God made the hazelnut, it being quite unthinkable that the hazelnut could account for its own existence. The second is that God loves the hazelnut. Why otherwise would he fashion something he couldn't love? There must accordingly be something good, lovely even, in all that God made. And finally, that God looks after that hazelnut from moment to moment. Three things that actually reflect well on the rest of the big story of creation. And all of this moves the Blessed Julian to burst forth with stupefied amazement. What is he indeed that is maker and lover and keeper? And there are no words, of course, adequate to describe, much less comprehend, who or what God is. For until I am one with him, I can never have true rest nor peace. I can never know it, she concludes. Until I am held so close to him, there is nothing in between. Now, just note that interconnectedness of everything, that what she's talking about there. I'm going to come back to that. I think there is something of this in John 1 as he describes the experience of being born of God, verse 13. Being able to see a glimpse of the divine all around and to treasure that as deeply, deeply special and significant. To have our breath taken away, not just by the stunning and the impressive, but by the small and the weak. And in humility to realize that each living being, even the insignificant, is created, loved, and cared for, in Julian's words, including you and me. And it's that bigger picture that John paints for us in chapter 1. That's what makes this such an epic start to the whole gospel. Now, I have to say, I think that's what we're dreadfully bad at doing. The darkness may have been overcome, but it hasn't disappeared. The world doesn't recognize the divine in the world. And sadly, too often, they don't see the need to treasure and nurture what we have. Exploitation of the resources we've been given, abuse of the world's beauty, casual neglect of the duty to find ways to work with the divine gift, wars that exterminate hope and lives, global industries that care only about keeping the shareholders happy, blindness to the poverty that dehumanizes individuals and communities. You can go on and on about how we've neglected and abused this gift, but it all comes down to the same thing in the end, that same little three-letter word, sin. Sin is by definition that which attempts to elevate the human above the divine. Well, it's that which says, I'm more important than God and the things of God, which is the polar opposite of the humility that we should be presenting ourselves to God with, that seeks the highest place, not the lowest. And I think we need to recognize that actually we live in a world that is deeply broken by sin, that is against everything that actually is the big picture of God that John paints for us. Which brings me to actually the final point I want to make, which is all to do with interconnection and relationship. I think everyone who works in any sort of theological environment knows that the key to understanding anything about God is to understand that God is in relationship. Obviously, God is relationship. The Trinity is relationship. And here in the first verse of the gospel, we have the Word was with God and the Word was God. It's a statement about God being three persons, or at least two of the three persons. Jesus here is indistinguishable from the Godhead in terms of function. And in verse 14, we read, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. Relationship not just with God himself, but with the created, with the created order itself. And as we all know from Genesis chapter 1, all of that was good. This is how perfection works. It's all about relationship and interconnectedness. Us with God, God with God, God with us, and us with each other. And that's why broken relationships that destroy are such terrible sin. Now, when you apply that to the created order, the breakup of the created order is just a terrible sin against God. Think of Ukraine. Putin has deliberately broken relationship. He's gone to war with his neighbor. And what follows is the destruction of life, the destruction of the environment, the destruction of hope. It's sinful. Think of the destruction of habitats which break our relationship with the created order. We can all see the way in which our planet is breaking down in so many ways. We've become familiar with those pitiful pictures of polar bears sitting on ever decreasing ice sheets. It doesn't have to be like that. I'm sure you've all read some of the touching stories about regenerating the created order. I read again recently that the story of the reintroduction of wolves to one of the wildernesses in the United States. You probably are familiar with this one. A small thing, you'd think, just reintroducing wolves. But what has happened by reintroducing those wolves is that suddenly the deer numbers, which were causing such destruction, have been controlled. And immediately the whole created order becomes what it should be. The river courses are restored, flooding is controlled. And so it goes on. My heart sang in the summer when, even through the hardest of droughts, those areas where beavers have been reintroduced to this country were not affected so badly by droughts because the beavers were naturally controlling the flow of the river. Now that's the sort of thing that makes my heart sing. A guy called George, I don't know how you pronounce his name, George Monbiot, I don't know, Regenesis. I don't know whether any of you have read that book, Regenesis. It's an astonishing work that actually talks about some of the difficulties that we are creating in the world because we let our relationship with the created order break down. Now, I don't think he's a Christian, but I think in example after example, what he shows is actually exactly what John would have commended. That the world is amazing in its complexity and patterns, all related. His first chapter in that book is an extraordinary piece of work where he looks at a cross-section of the soil from his own garden and examines the interrelatedness of everything within that soil. He says the soil might be the most complex living of all systems, yet we treat it like dirt. I rather like that. He talks about the interrelationship. He talks, he gives the example of how scientists at the Max Planck Institute in Germany have discovered that 40% of all the rainfall in East Africa is caused by the watering of fields in India and Pakistan, 6,000 kilometers away. When the water is confined to rivers, there's very little surface evaporation, but spread out over the fields and through transpiration, clouds are produced that travel on the prevailing winds and water the desert in East Africa. But if the prevailing winds change direction, as is happening because of climate change, Africa starves. He talks about the breaking of the interrelationship in our food production, which is having huge consequences on the breakdown of soil in all cultures, which is affecting production. And the only way to restore the world is to restore relationships at a very deep level, to get back in touch with nature, and equally to restore relationships with each other. Now, you can't solve the environment alone. We can only do that together, but we all have a part to play. And that's, I suggest, the Christian way. That's also why, to be honest, I have environmental anxiety, because I question whether such relationship is ever going to be possible. The COP process has been depressingly ineffective, yet it's probably our only hope to save this world. I don't see any sense in which government are driving the necessity of change. And frankly, what we saw from our own Conservative government last Friday was, I would go so far as to say, shockingly evil. And I don't use those words lightly. In removing wildlife grants to farmers to leave parts of their fields wild, I think it was effectively what the RSPB has described as an attack on nature. And remember, that is effectively an attack on God himself. I don't see any attempt to build a green future for this nation at the moment. Not led by government, anyway. No attempt to save energy by bringing insulation grants or anything like that. It was complacent in the extreme, and whilst as a priest, I'm not supposed, I guess, to take political sides, you have to call out sin where you see it. And I would suggest that you could describe the mini budget that we all experienced last week as a sinful budget because of the priorities and the direction it's set. Well, I've said enough. I'll leave some time for questions. And I hope that I've provoked enough to perhaps get a few comments or questions from you. It would be lovely to be able to explore some of this. But I hope you'll take away from this that actually we all have a part to play. We are created good. We are created in the most extraordinary and wonderful world. And I hope and pray that we can actually make a difference. Over to you. Any questions?
Jane Jones has got a question.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, Jane.
Okay. I don't believe that God hasn't created everything that we see. I agree with what you said about relationship. And for me, where I see God, when I respond to some of the wonderful sunsets we have recently, in the last couple of years, I have just been gobsmacked, as you say, by some of the skies. It's the reaction. And the reason I see God in the reaction is because of what happens when you get the opposite situation. And David Attenborough lost all faith in God when he was in Africa as quite a young man and sat talking to a child and watched an eye worm come out of this child's eye. He said, no way have we got a loving God that created absolutely everything that was here. No way would a loving God create something like that. What I see is his reaction, God in his reaction, God in the reaction of people who are so outraged by something as horrible as that, to put their hands in their pockets for scientific research, for charities to support people, for prevention and cure. And I think that it's the way we are moved to do something about it that is where God is. And I think the way we are moved by awe and wonder and struck by the beauty of nature as well, because nature isn't all beautiful and wonderful. There is nature red in tooth and claw as well. And it's interesting that in the book of Genesis, there is no predator and prey, no eating other living creatures. That comes later on. And I think the breakdown in our relationship with nature comes when we want to worship it. We want to think that everything in nature is necessarily good, and it's not. There are some very nasty, horrible things in nature. But I think the way God stimulates us to respond to that is where God is.
Thank you. I'm not going to disavow you of anything you've just said. I would say that if I was trying to argue this in a sort of fairly conservative theological way, I would say, well, yeah, but let's not forget that what was created good went through the fall, and therefore what was created good changed. Now, what that means, I don't know. And
what would you say to David Attenborough when he responded with such horror at what he
yeah, wrote? I would say that this world has difficult things to assess. But then if you can go down to the very smallest microorganisms and see horrific things in a way. We are in a process from the moment we're born. We're in a process of decay, and therefore some would find that in itself an argument against God. I'm not going to say one way or the other, really. I mean, I'll be honest. I say I don't know. What I am prepared to say, I think, that is, I do believe that God created what we see around us, and that at its core, it is the most extraordinary ecosystem, if you want, in itself, that is beautiful, painful, extraordinary, awesome, but at times difficult to understand. Does God still love us in all of that? Well, he entered that creation in Jesus, so we're told here in John 1, becoming flesh, understanding the world as we understand it, that he might redeem it. And I like to think, I hope, that one day it will be redeemed, so that when we have a new heaven and a new earth, whatever that is, there won't be any worm climbing out of a child's eye. It will be once again perfect in every way. But it isn't perfect in every way at the moment. It's a fallen world, and we make our contribution to that. But as Christians, it seems to me, our call is to build the kingdom of God. And building the kingdom of God, to me, is partly about restoring what is good in nature, and trying to protect what God has, I would say, created. Does that help? I don't know. We can disagree. We're allowed to disagree. That's all right on these occasions.
I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but it's something that non-Christians often will say to you.
Yeah, I'm sure. And absolutely. I
think the way people are moved, like with the tsunami. I was besieged when I went into school after Christmas. After that, you're a Christian. Explain to us then why 125,000 people died. Well, 125,000 people died because of greed, because they cut down the mangrove swamps, which would have prevented that flooding. That there were people that don't have enough healthcare. Nobody puts any money in. Everybody goes there for cheap holiday. And I could have come up with all those reasons why those people died. Yes, okay, the tsunami was still going to happen because tectonic plates moved. But, those deaths could have been prevented if people hadn't been so greedy and impoverished that area. They could have had early warning systems like there are in richer areas of the world. And yeah, but it's our reaction to things, to me, that is where I see God. And
so do I. I mean, let's face it, some of the heroic stories you hear of those who went in to try and put things right after the disaster were absolutely, I would say, where God was. But when you actually get down to individual situations like that, you'll never quite explain it away.
No. But it's our human nature that's fallen, really. Our human nature that's ceased to see the other person as being equal in God.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, Keith.
Yeah, I'm very interested in your political point towards the end, and I would wholeheartedly agree with it. My question is really, is the church being prophetic enough in calling out sin in high places, in government, wherever, or are we just afraid of being told, well, you stick to your religion, you stick to your religion, and we'll deal with the politics, and we'll deal with the economics and all the rest of it? Are we being prophetic enough?
Oh gosh, good question, Keith. I don't know. I would love to. Wouldn't it be lovely if, when something is spoken out by the church in some way, that is treated with respect, at least, and examined with respect? I think it rather depends on who agrees with us. I am well aware that there have been many things that have been said in the House of Lords, for example, by the bishops who sit there, challenging the government's response to the environment, all of which I would agree with, and most of which is dismissed. And I think it is extremely difficult for us to have our voice heard, not least, of course, because it's very easy to point to the church as an organization that fails to live up to the highest ideals that we set. And so we are still, for example, as the Church of England, investing in Shell. Well, you know, there are the arguments that actually we want to get to the shareholders meeting so that we can actually argue at the shareholders meeting against some of the policies of Shell. But the fact is, we are still investing in a company that is, although I think it is making necessary changes to its practices, has for years raped this earth of its resources. How do you explain that one away? And Christian Climate Action quite rightly protested at the General Synod a few weeks back, and stopped the debate that was happening to make it clear that they didn't think very much of that. You could point to any number of other examples. We've got this net zero 2030 target, and yet, let's be honest, not everybody in the church is wholeheartedly trying to get us there. There are quite a few people who would turn around and say, this is not the right thing to do because we are going to necessarily impact the world in a negative way and probably have to divert resources from, for example, looking after the poor in order to reach that target. Well, again, you can argue that very well. We will never win. There will always be somebody who will say, you call us out and then look at yourself. So, you know, they will point to the fact that the Archbishop of Canterbury has taken 50 flights in the last year or whatever. Should he? Should he not? You need the wisdom of Solomon sometimes, don't you? But yes, I think we do need to have our voice heard. Yes, I think we do need to be prepared to take the flak at times and say, actually, you know, that decision was a poor decision. And the truth is, we could have been going for renewable, sustainable energy for years, and our governments haven't. We could have been insisting on solar panels on all new houses for years, and we haven't. There could have been all sorts of things that could have been done, but haven't been. And I don't think it's wrong to be able to say, actually, we believe that actually this is God's creation, and you're not looking after it. And therefore, when you get it wrong, or you don't make the effort, or you don't invest enough in putting things right, we will call you out. Anything else? I'm conscious it's already 52. Gosh, time flies, isn't it?
Yes, we probably need to finish.
We've got you. You're going to let your husband have one go.
I'm very sympathetic to everything you've been saying, Ian, although I would want to question some ways in which you frame the narrative. One aspect in particular is your very quick jump to talk about love, which is not a word I find in the prologue of the fourth gospel. Can you tell us what love is?
Oh my goodness. Thanks, George.
In relation to John 1:1-14.
What is love in relation to John 1? I think it is that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The sacrifice of God coming and living amongst his people.
Yeah, I think John talks about it as glory. So there's just a little bit of verbal slippage.
Okay, you're a far greater theologian than I, George. I'm happy to take that. I would say I see love in that, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Anne.
Ian, thank you very much for putting into words some of my own thoughts. But having listened to you and to Kathleen last week about this first passage, and that soon we will be having carol services where this will be one of the passages that's read out. And every year I cringe because I think so many people come to that service who are not necessarily Christian and will be confused by it. And having sat and listened to you and Kathleen over the last 2 weeks, I've learned stuff, I'm glad to say, but how on earth does someone sitting in a congregation actually make sense of this passage?
I think it's a very good question. What are people coming for at Christmas?
Yeah.
It seems to me that they are coming for all sorts of different reasons, some to do with tradition, some to do with a sense of nostalgia, some because the family told them to be there. What do you want them to take away, though? You want them to take away that God has come down and become a part of all that we are, experienced all that we do, and has held us because he loves. And I think you can relate that to John 3:16. And I would say that if you get people leaving, having understood that much, the Word made flesh, made his dwelling amongst us, I don't know that you can really ever get much more across than that.
No.
But if they get that, that's transformative, I think.
Yeah, I just think it's a very difficult passage for someone who doesn't read their Bible to hear and think, well, what was that about?
Yes, it is. It is. It's because it's metaphor, isn't it?
Yes.
It's poetic. It's not a story, and so therefore, unless you actually really do get who God is, I think you would find it very difficult to link into that. But some will.
Yeah.
And some will like that, the fact that it is this wonderfully flowery way of almost of describing the relationship of God and man.
Thank you.
Humanity.
Ian, thank you so much. Thank you for taking us and opening our eyes to lots of things I certainly hadn't thought of, and quite inspiring. Thank you so much.
Bless you.
Delight to listen to you. Thank you so much from all of us. And there was some silent clapping when you finished, and I'm sure we'll all clap as well to say thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom and thoughts with us.
I'm just sorry you didn't hear from Rowan. If you want to look him up, he's on YouTube. Just look up Rowan Williams' Environment. You'll find it. Thank you very much. And so next week we have what is truth, another big question. That's going to be a challenge. What is truth today? And instead of Eve Parker, who's been called away somewhere to foreign parts that Liz mentioned last week, Liz Shercliffe is going to talk to us, and it is something she's been interested in for many years. So she's not coming with a lack of knowledge at all, but with a great deal of study behind her. So next week we have Liz. Have a good week, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.